Hello, my name's Andrew from Four Corners of the Page. Welcome back to my channel. My name isn't really Andrew. What I did there is I'm making fun of Ashley, who misnamed me about a month ago, but we've moved past
Oh.
it. Hello, Ashley. You knew I was
Hello.
going to do that. I told you.
I knew you were going to do it because I was
Yeah.
hoping I was going to say, hi, Andrew.
Do you want to introduce your channel for us very quickly, Ashley?
Yeah, my channel I feel like it's still quite new, but it's Library of a Silver Saint is my channel where I talk about a lot of fantasy books, but I also mention Empire of the Vampire by J. Kristoff quite a lot, which is probably quite annoying to a lot of people.
I haven't read it.
That's okay.
Neither, but I
That's
want
okay.
to after hearing you and Jake talk about it so much, so
Oh, I just
yeah,
adore it.
Hi,
fantastic.
Joanna.
Hi, I'm Joanna from Joanna Reads, and I'm a huge fan of both David's channel and Ashley's channel. I think two of my favorite new channels that have sprung on the scene this year, so happy to talk with both of you about dark books, one of my favorite things to talk about. So, yeah, happy to be here.
Well, Joanna, I feel like my channel is also like 20% your channel at this point because I keep inviting you on for collaboration. So,
Yeah,
um,
became quick friends.
yes. It's lovely to have you guys here. Here's what the topic is going to be. It's going to be, and it's kind of in line with spooky season, which is why I've carved all these pumpkins behind me. Why do we love dark books? Because as far as I'm aware, guys, we are three relatively well-adjusted people who don't seem to have many skeletons in the closet, and yet we all, to some extent, do enjoy reading dark fiction, or maybe watching dark TV shows, or playing dark video games. There's something kind of magnetic about horror or some kind of despair or suffering or whatever in books that we are all to some extent kind of drawn towards. And not just the three of us, but I think this is a much broader thing. We can get into some of this later, but for example, the amount of Death Game TV shows that have come out in the last year or two is pretty crazy. Squid Game, Alice in Borderland. Stephen King is a whole kind of shelf unto himself in every single bookstore. There's something about darkness that kind of hypnotizes us as a culture, as a society. Um, and so I wanted to have that chat. So what I want to do, first of all, is pass this question to you both. I want to ask you, when I say darkness in fiction, what does your mind immediately go to? Do you think of any kind of particular genre or subgenre, or do you think of any books or texts in particular? Ashley, if I can pass this question to you first, I'd be really curious to hear your response.
I think because I'm sort of quite new to sort of this sort of genre, really. The first thing that comes to my mind is grimdark because I feel like that word gets thrown around quite a lot definitely on the sort of side of booktube and bookstagram that I sort of mostly interact with. So when I immediately think of grimdark, I the first author that comes to mind is like Joe Abercrombie because he's like, you know, Lord Grimdark. He's associated with it so much. But so I think immediately, as soon as I hear about dark fiction, that's the sort of thing that comes to mind. But then I also think about anything remotely sort of, I guess, anything with dark themes in terms of horror, anything like that, anything that's got quite a lot of warfare and things like that in, anything like that, that's immediately what comes to mind. But actually, the more I've explored different genres and different books in sort of like the last year or so, I've kind of seen that it incorporates so many more things than just that on different levels. And yeah, so even some books that I would never have seen or I'd never even would have even thought about being labeled as dark, they actually have started falling into that genre for me. So it's quite interesting because some automatically come to mind, but now that you sort of say that, it makes me think of so many other types. But yeah,
Can
I
I
think
ask,
grimdark is the first thing.
is there any book in particular that you didn't initially, because I had the same thing, initially categorized as a dark book, and then upon that reflection, realizing actually, no, I would categorize this as some kind of dark text?
Oh, yes. So actually, one of the series that I just recently finished, and Joanna, you also recently finished it. I wouldn't say it's completely dark, but it definitely has dark themes, which is The Live-Ship Traders by Robin Hobb
Mm.
in Realm of the Elderlings. Definitely not labeled as a dark book, but really definitely touches on some themes that I would say are quite dark. And then another book that I didn't think was dark at the time that I read it, but now I look back, I think, oh no, that really was. And it's A Little Life by Hanya Yanagihara,
Yeah.
which I read quite a few years ago now, but it's not labeled as being dark at all. And it's sort of it was quite popular. It was spoken about a lot. It was every time I went into the bookshop, it was always out, and there was nothing around any of the sort of marketing for it that ever made me think that it was a dark book. And then I read it and was quite surprised by all the themes that it touched on. So yeah, I think those are a couple that they definitely don't strike me as being dark like at first, but they definitely go into those themes.
So we have about 3 or 4 authors within that I'd love to touch on, and maybe we can touch on as we go forward. But I also do want to pass to Joanna. And is there anything there that you'd want to touch on, Joanna, or any or your own interpretation of this question?
No, it's just interesting because I so I tend to gravitate towards what I would consider dark books, and when I think of dark books, I think of books that deal with the difficult side of the human condition, things that I feel like in our pop culture or society, we easily want to brush under the rug and not look at and not grapple with. And so the books that I think about that are dark are ones that make me confront either challenging questions or challenging situations or put me in a perilous um uh, like perilous situation where I don't have an easy answer. uh Books that explore trauma. And so I could certainly see how like trauma is definitely prevalent, I would say, in Robin Hobb's books. And yeah, it's interesting because I know the term grimdark is often used. It's not a term I tend to use anymore. And it's mostly because, unless it's like, I guess it just depends. I know that Joe Abercrombie is known for being like Lord Grimdark. I saw an interview with him at one point, and he said that he wasn't actively trying to write grimdark books, and yet that label was put on him, and that he took on the Lord Grimdark candle as kind of a tongue-in-cheek thing. But his books are, I would say, dark for sure. They do explore dark themes, but they are at the same time so entertaining and so
Mhm.
funny that I feel like it somehow, acts as a barrier for me thinking of it as dark as some other books that I've read that have left me in an existential crisis or, have just gotten under my skin. Ashley, I think you mentioned on your channel, am I right? My Dark Vanessa? Well, had you
Yes.
mentioned that recently? And about
Yeah.
how it's so interesting because that book, I know you had mentioned that the UK cover art of that book does not indicate the depth and darkness and how disturbing that book is. The US cover art actually does it justice because it has this black and white coloring, and yeah, it's more grayscale, I would say. And yet the title, it has dark in the title, but you read the book, my goodness. Have you read it, David, by any chance? Yeah,
No, I've seen pupils read it, and I've always been advised by other teachers that they shouldn't be reading it, but I've got no idea what it's about. I just
it
know it's pretty out there.
yeah, it's basically taking the Lolita situation, but putting it in the woman's point of view, and we're following the woman when she's an adult, thinking back on her past. She's being approached by people from the Me Too movement trying to get her to come out with her story, and she's struggling because when she looks back on her past, she was groomed by her teacher. But in her mind, that wasn't grooming. That was a truly romantic connection. And when she starts to process her memories throughout the book, she starts to slowly become aware that, oh, wow, this wasn't quite so romantic after all. This was perhaps abuse. And so it, it's an incredibly unsettling story, incredibly unsettling. Um, and yeah, and that's actually a book that would be labeled, I think, under contemporary fiction, if I'm not mistaken. But certainly that one I have a video on my channel from a few years ago called the most dark and 10 most dark and disturbing books I've ever read. That definitely made the list. But yeah, I guess that's my long-winded answer to your question, are books that make me look at uncomfortable, unsettling situations, things that we don't necessarily want to get too deep into, or we want to look at a distance. And I think books kind of invite you in to look at those things in a much more intimate way sometimes.
You know, I had this written down too, that books are almost they can give us almost a reflection of reality, if that's one way of putting it. I think the example that you guys just used is much more about like a personal or kind of maybe social issue, or kind of the really dark ends of a personal or social issue. And when I was doing a little bit of research this afternoon, this was coming up too. The idea that often the darkest moments of books are moments of cultural anxiety and social anxiety. And one of the examples that I found, this is not my original thought. I'm just going to pass it off as my original thought because I like plagiarizing.
Yes, we know.
Often,
Just kidding.
or
Sorry.
often the types of horror in books come from environmental concern, is what one person said, which I think is really interesting. So, A Song of Ice
Mm,
and Fire, for example, is not necessarily a horror book. It's definitely a dark book, but arguably the section of that text that is in some way the darkest, or certainly the most paranormal, are the White Walkers north of the Wall.
mhm.
And what this commenter was saying is you could absolutely read that as a concern of the environment and climate change. You have all these people squabbling for the throne down below, when in reality there's a tsunami of violence coming towards you, and that darkness is deeply rooted into, in one interpretation, our current climate concerns, that everyone's jockeying for power, and in 50 years some countries might have gone under the sea.
I think that's really interesting. I've never heard that interpretation before. I think the only pushback I would have with it is that it's so clearly a different world. At least I read it this way. So my reading could be wrong, but I read it so much as another world. And in that world, seasons last a much, much longer time.
Mhm.
So it for me, I think because the framing of it felt so clearly, distinctly different from our world that I didn't quite make that analogy in my mind. I'm not saying that my reading is right, but yeah, that's interesting. It's interesting to consider that.
I mean, it's certainly one interpretation, and it might not
Mm.
be the only interpretation, but it is one that does seem to click a little bit. The other one that I was going to mention very quickly is Three Body Problem: The Remembrance of Earth's Past, which I can't talk about very much because I'm so wary of spoiling this trilogy. But there's something similar, right? You know, we're all squabbling, and there's these big seismic things coming at us, and how are we going to handle that? So I guess that's me kind of springboarding off your point, Joanna. You know, and maybe it's not just kind of um, issues of trauma and memory, but it's also can be a bit broader.
But
I don't
you
know.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Oh, I was just going to add to that. Ice by Anna Kavan, which you and I have both read, is also looking at environmental issues, but it's also making a connection between those environmental issues and patriarchy, and the way patriarchy is affecting our environment and our world, and the misogyny and trauma that's connected to that. So I just wanted to add that component to that because I think it's so relevant to your point. Yeah.
yep. Ashley, have you read Ice?
I haven't, but I
Oh
think
my
I
goodness.
think I watched one of Joanna's videos recently where you spoke about it, Joanna. It sounded amazing.
Yeah, yeah, it's a very disturbing read for sure, and I could the only thing I'll warn readers about is that, yes, it's extremely disturbing, but also it has a dreamlike quality to it, so it does tend to get a bit repetitive, and I know some people get weary of that by the end of the book, but I found it an extremely compelling read, and it was specifically because of the way it made those connections, and I would say Le Guin actually, I think Le Guin does something similar with that in The Word for World is Forest, which is a short science fiction book that she wrote. So I don't know. I think there might even be connections to that in possibly in The Left Hand of Darkness, if I'm not mistaken. But yeah, it's one that's interesting just to look at how environmental themes are connected to human behavior and to the darker side of us and what we're doing. So yeah, I love that connection.
I haven't read any of the ones that you've spoken about, but immediately I'm thinking I want to add them all to my list. I'm quite new to these kinds of books. I've really only been reading darker dark fiction, I would say, for the past year or so. So a lot of the titles I've read in the last year are dark, but they're gradually getting darker. I'm finding that I'm seeking it out more, which is something that it makes me question myself and why I'm doing it, which is why I find this topic so interesting. Because I've recently been reading a lot of things like Berserk and things like that,
Mm,
which are incredibly dark. But I didn't. But yes, I'm enjoying them so much
mm.
and questioning myself as I'm enjoying it. and
Do you mind? I
wondering
mean,
why.
I don't want to exclude you, Joanna, because I know that you haven't read far into Berserk if at all. But I think this might be an interesting one to touch on because actually, I know that what volume are you at in Berserk?
I just started volume 13 this morning.
Okay. I think this would be a really interesting one to touch upon in the sense of why do we love dark books and which dark books do we like and why? Because Berserk is incredibly popular. And you're right, it's also utterly, utterly grim. So what is it about Berserk that attracts you to it? Is it that you're attracted to Berserk in spite of the darkness that it carries or because of the darkness it carries?
Maybe maybe because of the dark it carries. I I feel like Berserk is, for me, it's a bit of a window into seeing probably some of the absolute extremes that humanity can go to. But yeah, I feel like I'm safe as a reader exploring those themes. And I think something that I'm really grappling with whilst I'm reading it is, though so much bad is happening, is it all okay if there's a greater good on the other side, or if there's good throughout it? So I think I'm just interested to see, I guess, why people do things, why people make certain choices, because in throughout Berserk so many awful things happen, and it just feels like a safe way to explore it. I don't know how to describe that in any better way that makes any more sense. It just, I don't know. It feels like I say, looking at the worst extremes of the human condition, of the human experience, but yet through in a safe, contained environment. I don't know how to describe it.
Yeah, I'm curious too because I have read the first 2 volumes of Berserk, and I've
Mm.
not read further. And I understand that there are some pretty intense, heavy essay scenes in the series. Whenever you've read some of those parts, have you I don't know how to say this, like and maybe just any of the dark material in Berserk. Has it ever been the case where you put the book down and it's like you feel fine, you feel kind of distanced from it immediately? Or is it like, oh, it's like getting like how I was describing My Dark Vanessa, where that particular book, for whatever reason, I mean, it really got under my skin.
Yeah.
But yeah, just curious about how it is. And because I think the other part of that being a manga, I also wonder if that helps to kind of remove the intensity of it too.
Was having a discussion about this with Callum Lott. I don't know if you've heard of him. He's like an indie author,
Mhm.
and I've had a chat with him about Berserk because he's a huge Berserk fan, and a lot of his work is partially he takes some of his inspiration from that. And I had a chat with him about it because I actually think I read volumes 11 and 12 last week, and one of them in particular made me sort of stop and actually
Mm.
put it down for a moment. And it was the first time that it had happened
Mhm.
because the author made a choice
Mm.
and I wasn't sure how I felt about it. And I spoke to Callum about it because I know he's such an enormous fan. And I said there was a moment where I really had to think, am I okay with that? I'm not sure if I'm okay with that. And he
Mhm.
said because of the fact that it is a graphic novel, because you are actually seeing it in front of you, it makes it so much more intense.
Oh, wow.
Mm.
And I thought, actually, no, that makes a lot of sense. You know, I can see this thing happening. Maybe that's why I had such a visceral response to it in comparison to maybe some of the other scenes that I'd seen.
Yeah.
And then, but he also said about, of course, it was, written, Japan, it's completely different culture, completely different sort of background for the stories. And some of those things have to be taken into consideration as well.
Mm.
And that was also something that I found really interesting because I hadn't thought of either of those things. As obvious as they seem, I hadn't thought about that. And that kind of helped me process it a little bit more. But I
Mhm.
don't know, I definitely had to, it was the first time that I've ever actually put a book down and thought, oh, yeah, I'm
Yeah.
not sure how I feel about that because it did really, it was at the point where I kind of thought it's now potentially stepping into gratuitous sort of territory for me,
Mm.
and I did sort of think about that a lot. So but that's yeah, it was the first time I'd had that experience. It's funny that to me, it's strange that that was the first time that I'd ever felt that, because other than that, I've never ever put a book down for that reason or
Mm.
stopped.
But
Um,
all I was going to say is I think it's good to have that conversation with yourself, because I'm not going to spoil anything for you, but that kind of stuff doesn't go away. It's pretty
no.
persistent throughout the series. But I also really am intrigued by a couple of things that you said. The first thing was that you really enjoy Berserk, and part of the reason, and you're quite honest there. I don't want to misinterpret you, but you said I enjoy it partly because of the darkness that goes on, and it feels kind of more unique and original because it has those elements. But you also said, and Joanna, I'm now thinking of our Scott Baker,
Mm.
and the Second Apocalypse trilogy, because you said actually it also does expose the brightness on the other side with Berserk. That there are these moments of love and warmth and friendship and loyalty. And so I guess I'm wondering, would we still want to read these dark books? Maybe this goes back to the grimdark conversation. If they are kind of inescapably dark and just bleak, full stop, is that something you guys would still be interested in reading?
I don't think so. The word that always comes to mind for me is chiaroscuro, which is the blending of dark and light, and the lighter the lights, the darker the darks, and that contrast is what creates that's what creates the compelling experience. And actually, you had this wonderful interview with the YA horror novelist. I'm sorry, I'm forgetting his name.
Darren Shan.
Darren Shan, yes. And you had a fabulous interview with him. And he was talking about when he writes horror, that there's a misconception that every scene and everything has to be completely dark and macabre, and that that's not the case, that you actually have to have layers of love and have layers of hope. And there has to be other things happening in order to bring out that darkness, because otherwise that darkness is meaningless. If you don't care, like, you have to care, and what's caring has to, I think, come from some other aspects or other elements of being integrated into the story. That's my feelings about it. But I think there's probably maybe a counterexample to that for for everything I'm going to say. Um, but actually, I want to put the question on you, David. How did you respond to Berserk? What was your experience like with that? How did you handle those situations when they arose on the page, especially as a first time reader?
Well, the good news, Joanna, is that I'm dead inside, and nothing can affect me anymore. Uh, No. So I was thinking of the same thing as Ashley was talking, and this is a slight digression to this question, but I think it is appropriate. I was thinking about today different media and different types of storytelling, and how my reaction changes based on the form that the story takes. So I was thinking about manga, I was thinking about movie and TV, I was thinking about video games, and I was thinking about books. And say you
Mhm.
have an equally dark story in each of those modes, how does that affect me differently? And so I literally took pen and paper. I wrote this out to kind of come to terms with it. And my initial reaction to this question was that dark video games, tend to affect me the least. And I
Mhm.
think that is because, with very very few exceptions, in a video game you are empowered. The design is for you to kind of guns blazing to a certain extent, get out there and overcome the evil. And usually there is positive kind of victory there. So one of my favorite video games of all time is a game called Dead Space, where you are one man on an alien spaceship that's filled with zombies, and it's much more interesting than that sounds.
Mhm.
And it's horrifying, and it's really bleak, actually, Dead Space. But because at the end of the day you're a guy with a gun, taking things out, there's that feeling of, I guess, empowerment and autonomy. And then I thought about, I'll go for books next, prose books. Prose books, I think, on some level, affect me the most when it's more kind of nihilistic, existential, kind of bleak questions. When it's something that makes me think,
Mhm.
that really kind of unsettles me strongly, because I hate thinking. So I think, for example, Ice would be a good example. Tender is the Flesh, which I believe some of us have read in this. Joanne, have you read Tender is the Flesh?
No, I haven't wanted to. Every time I hear
That
about it, I'm like, "Oh, I don't know if that sounds like a thing I would enjoy."
it really unsettled me, not because of what was happening
Yes.
on the page, but because I kept thinking about it and the themes and the concepts. Similarly, A Short Stay in Hell by Stephen L. Pegg. I've thought about that book every day, and I read it about 6 months ago because of the ideas underneath. Um, I totally agree, Ashley, with what you're saying, because with manga and with TV and movies, because there's that visual element that you don't have agency over, when you're seeing stuff, when you're witnessing it, I can find that really, really difficult. Um, when the pace is not my pace, when someone else decides the pace at which I'm reading it, and I can't, necessarily go past a paragraph that's really unsettling me or walk away. I find that I'm kind of on the rails. And so with manga, it does kind of get under my skin. The visual element does get under my skin. There's something about when it's in front of you, kind of pictorially, if that's the word, visually, that I do find a lot more unsettling in my
I
dark
felt
fiction.
that, I felt that way about the Game of Thrones TV show during, and part of it was the phase of life I was going in at the time. I was in at the time, and it's also such a huge departure from the books. The books are far better, everybody, but but the show, it got so, I don't know. It made some choices that were incredibly unsettling. Like, I did not feel comfortable at all when I was watching some of those seasons or watching some of those episodes, especially with what they did with Sansa Stark specifically. And
Mm.
so yeah, I don't know. It yeah, it felt icky. It felt icky to me, especially because it felt like it was trying to do things for the views and for the shock. And sometimes, I don't know, sometimes I feel like I want a little bit more of a depth or purpose to things rather than just violence just for shock value, so to speak. I don't know how I feel about that. I go back and forth about how I feel about that. I'll say. I'm not saying I'm definitely dug in on one thing or another, but for that, and that show, it did bother me, but it also could have been where I was in life at the time, and I wasn't reading dark books, so it'd be interesting to find out how much that was affecting me because even at that time, I remember I was watching, Breaking Bad, and I loved Breaking Bad, but I have to admit that there was one particular episode, I think I told you about it one time, David. There's one particular episode that it got under my skin, like, I realized afterwards, I'm like, "I don't know if I can continue watching this show. I don't know if I can." And I did, and I'm glad I did, but, ooh, it felt like it was almost pushing a boundary at a certain point with what happened, and yeah, it was, I don't know, it's hard to know if that would have gotten to me more in a book or less in a book than when seeing it on the screen.
Would you
Yeah.
agree with me, Joanna, that the stuff, the darkness in books that stays with you more is the more kind of abstract stuff that gets the wheels turning in your head? Would you agree with that?
I don't know if I would call it abstract
That's
necessarily.
the wrong word, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, but I think I know what you mean.
Conceptual?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. I don't know if I would call it that, but what I would say is I think I'm on the same wavelength where the last book, well, I don't know. I've read a few really dark stories recently. Uh, I'll admit, like last night, I read the Lottery short story by Shirley Jackson, and whoa, that's only a few pages long, and it got under my skin a little bit. Yeah, and that, but the last book that really unsettled me before that, like, really unsettled me, was my reread this week of I Who Have Never Known Men by Jacqueline Hartman, one of my favorite books of the year, possibly my favorite book of the year, I'm not sure yet, but I reread that earlier this week because I'm gonna be in a discussion about it soon, and wow, that I can't talk about it obviously, but when I finished the book, I pretty much almost spiraled. Like, I felt like I almost went through an existential crisis. But it felt like, yeah, it was partly that. I mean, we're in a person's head, we're in her story, we're in her perspective, but it's also taking in something so much bigger than that. Of what's happening to her is symbolic of something so much bigger that I guess maybe in that way conceptual. Yeah, that's why I think I might be on your same wavelength, David. I might be on your same wavelength with that. like looking at the meaning of life, basically,
Yeah.
is what I'm talking about.
Well, the only thing I wanted to ask very quickly, Ashley, is
Mm.
have you read I Who Have Never Known Men? You were nodding
I
along there.
have. I
Yeah.
have, yeah, I have read it. I think what is so interesting about Who Have Never Known Men is the fact that it's so you could I could imagine some people reading it and not thinking that it's that dark, because I think some people on some level, I know that sounds
Oh,
strange, but I
yeah.
think some people associate that with having, you know, extreme scenes
Hmm.
or that are in your face. And whereas the thing that, because that book really unsettled me as well,
Hmm.
it got under my skin because none of it is seen as sort of extreme, but it really packed a punch because, as you say, it's that the one woman, it's you are her, and I don't know, I can't get my words out for this one. It really packed a punch considering how small the book is as well. It's so
Yeah.
small,
Yeah.
it's so short, and but yet it dives into such big themes,
Hmm.
and I asked myself a lot of questions after I read
Hmm.
that,
Hmm.
and it just felt so. I guess it was almost like looking into a really strange mirror of our world. That has made me think that I want to reread it. And actually, one of my friends has just picked it up because she's going to read it because it was recommended to her. And I did say, buckle up. This is going to be.
Yeah.
I think this one's going to make you feel a lot of things.
I think it
It's
hit me even harder on the reread, to be honest.
I can
The
imagine.
first time I was like, "Whoa!" Like I knew favorite instantly. This last time though, I was like, I'm defeated somehow by this. And yeah, you're so right though, because we don't have anything that's like overtly dark on the page. Like it's not like yeah, there's in fact, and I don't think this is not, I mean, this, I don't think this is really a spoiler, but for being a book that is somewhat feminist, like I keep telling people it's not necessarily a feminist book. This is a book that goes so much deeper than just what it means to be female. It goes into what it means to be human. At the same time as it's a book, though, at the same time, it is definitely exploring the female experience. And yet it does so without any essay, which I know that sounds kind of nihilistic to say this because I feel like so many books that explore that theme tend to have essay in it, but it doesn't explore it with that. But it does it in the most, yeah, it's so, it does it with a subtle hand in some ways because it doesn't do that. It doesn't resort to what it could resort to, but it does go places. It doesn't hold back either. It is unflinching.
It is. It's just a complete. The women just have such a complete lack of agency. There's no agency whatsoever,
Yeah.
and that was that I think is probably what the most terrifying aspect of that was.
Yeah.
Um, in the first half in particular of the book. In the second half, I think it opens up a lot more
Mhm.
questions. But yeah, the lack of agency was just it was heavy.
Yeah. I mean, and I think that says it right there. I think that nihilism, if some books that are specifically geared to make you look at nihilism, because I think, and when I say that, regardless of what anyone believes about free will, about how many choices that we have in life, I think we can all maybe agree that even if we have free will, we might have a little bit less free will, maybe even just a little bit less than we sometimes like to believe. Is that fair to say? That maybe we have to come around to understanding how much our age or our time in living in this world, the period in which we're born, the resources around us, the families in which we were brought up, the experiences we had in childhood, uh, so many different factors affect our choices in life. Like there's going to be some limitation, and confronting that, I think, is unsettling. It is, and I think books that make us confront that lack of agency at times is hard.
I do want to get on to the next part of the conversation that you wanted to introduce, Joanna. But I feel like I would be remiss for the rest of us if one of you didn't give a 20-second kind of elevator pitch about what this book is about. Because I mean, you're talking about it a lot, but I still have no idea about what's actually going on, and I think it's important to maybe have that quick synopsis.
Yes. So I'll try my best. So this is following a young girl. She is one of 40 women who are locked in a bunker underground, and they basically have no they're given food, they're given enough to live, but they're given no privacy. They're basically trapped underground. And we're following in first person narration a nameless narrator. For some reason, I seem to like books with nameless narrators, is what I've noticed recently. But we're following a character who is nameless, who is the youngest of these 40 women. And as time has gone by, they have to accept the fact that they don't know what's happening. They don't know why they're there. But as they will eventually die away, she will be the last of them. And she doesn't remember, and I'll add this, she doesn't know anything about where she came from before because she was so young when she was brought into this bunker, whereas all the other women, the 39 other women, they remember their past. They remember their lives and society and community before they were trapped in this bunker underground. There's so much more I could say, but I'm just going to leave it at that. The story unfolds and goes further, but I think that's really all you need to know.
I promise, next time I'm in the bookshop, I will buy it.
Yes.
Because I've walked past it about 3 times, and I always look at the price, and I'm like, oh, but I will.
I
Because
wish I could send you a copy. It'd
I
probably
mean,
be like 3
listen,
times the price.
if,
But
if I wasn't, I could also buy it on Kindle, but I prefer the hardbacks. Anyway,
yeah.
Joanna, I know you had a follow-up point or kind of conversational topic you wanted to bring in.
Oh, sure. So I have a
No.
whole counterpoint to everything I just said, which is the fun part because there is something that's kind of fun about horror or about,
Hmm.
and I'm not going to say that about every book. I would not necessarily call I Who Have Never Known Men a fun book, but there are books that are a bit more fun, but still have a little bit of the macabre about them. Like, for example, I just finished yesterday, I We Have Always Lived in This Castle. I can never get the title right. We Have Always Lived in the Castle by Shirley Jackson. And I wouldn't necessarily call, I don't know, it's a strange book. It's a strange book. I'm just going to put it at that. But there are books like Fever Dream. I just read that earlier this month. It was a banger of a vampire story. I loved it, but it was also a bit swashbuckling and had great humor. But it was entertaining, and the gloomy, dark atmosphere was fun for me. I love that. I love that touch about it. And I haven't read Empire of a Vampire, but I get the sense there's a fun aspect to it too. Like you could have something that's dark and atmospheric and there's something that's aesthetic about it. That makes sense. Do you all agree with that?
I Do you guys know how Frankenstein was written? Do you guys know about this story?
Yes.
And if you do, can you pretend like you don't so I can explain it?
I
I
do
don't
know, but
know.
I'll pretend I don't.
Okay.
Tell me.
So basically, what happened in the early 1800s is that a volcano erupted. I think in Indonesia somewhere,
Mm,
and like one of these massive volcanoes. And I'll fact check this and make some corrections if I need to. This volcanic eruption was so intense that the ash and spume of the volcano worked its way into the stratosphere and basically shrouded the whole Earth like a blanket. And so the following year was called the year without a summer because this one volcanic eruption did such heavy kind of destruction on the planet that the summer the following year was so gloomy. Um, and so, oh my goodness, Mary Shelley was traveling with her mates around, I think it was Italy at the time. But because the weather was so awful because of this volcano, she basically had to, and her mates had to basically stay in an inn for the summer. Like they just sat in a pub for a month and hung out there because they couldn't do anything else. And that's where Frankenstein came about because Mary Shelley was my understanding is a little bit bored, and her mates were bored, and so she came up with the story of Frankenstein to entertain everyone as everyone was kind of story swapping around the campfire. Um, and I guess the reason this is coming to mind, Joanna, is because it's very much kind of like you're saying, like fundamentally, a lot of horror and dark books are enjoyable. There's a campfire element to them, or we're all kind of sitting
yeah.
around hearing something that's giving us kind of these chills or feelings. Someone like Stephen King is so good at evoking. And also something about dark books is they also feel a little bit forbidden, right? You feel a bit like sneaky when you're reading them, like something you shouldn't be doing. And maybe that's a holdover from kind of childhood when you stay up late to watch the horror movie and things like that. So I totally agree with what you're saying. Ashley, I don't know what you think about this. I mean, Empire of the Vampire sounds like is this to a T.
Yeah, definitely. I think Empire of the Vampire definitely has a very sort of a clear comedy in it. That a lot of the dialogue is quite comedic, and the characters are quite often quite funny. So it has very clear moments of comedic relief throughout. So it definitely does fit into that. I would say it's done quite. Is it done similarly or because I know that I would say something like the first Law trilogy is quite similar because there is so
Mhm.
much humor. It doesn't feel overall completely dark, even though it does explore really dark themes.
Mhm.
But no, I would agree, and I definitely sort of the campfire, it feeling a little bit forbidden. Definitely, it does feel like when I read a story that is quite dark, it does feel like I shouldn't be doing this. I shouldn't
Mhm.
enjoy this.
Yeah.
And that's why I think I ask myself the question so much more, like when I'm sort of seeking out these stories, like why am I looking for this? Why am I choosing darker and darker and darker stories? Or maybe it's not that they're getting darker, but maybe it's just that I'm so new to it that maybe it feels that way. I'm not sure because you guys, from what I've sort of seen from the sort of videos that you've made and the books that you guys have talked about, because you mentioned is it Baker?
Oh, yeah.
Scott Bakker
Oh,
a lot, and but I don't know anything about his books at all.
Yikes.
But you guys mention him a lot.
It is pretty
Is
imagine.
is there is there any comedy in there at all, or is that just
No.
dark?
Well, there's a tiny bit. Um, the most hideous covers, right? The most hideous covers
Oh God.
in fantasy existence. I swear, I feel like the series would be so much more popular if they had like a cover makeover, especially for that second series, Aspect
Agreed.
Emperor. Yeah, I mean, what do you think, David? Because there is a little bit of sardonic humor, I would say.
Imagine Berserk, but every single butterfly in the world of Berserk has been stamped and crushed on, and you're kind of halfway towards what R. Scott Baker is like. And maybe there's very pitch black humor. And I'm thinking of certain scenes that
Yes.
we
Yes.
can't talk about.
Hmm.
But is it humor or is it shock? Because it's kind of the same thing. Like it's like maybe people will die in certain ways in R. Scott Baker,
It's
and the way
it's
they
like
die is so over the top that you could maybe count it as funny, but I'm not sure.
no, that's not what I'm thinking
Yeah,
about. I'm mostly thinking about, do you know what I'm talking about? The storyline with, isn't it like an emperor and his
yeah,
mother? And
yeah.
that storyline I felt like was trying to be a bit absurdist in some ways. And it is dark. Yeah, it's like, it's dark though. But it's very, like, there was something about it that felt kind of absurd to me. So I guess I could maybe put it slightly on the humorous scale. And then but mostly no, I feel like it's a pretty dark story. It's a pretty dark story. I say that, and then people read it, and then some people are like, "It's not as dark as I was thinking." I'm like, "I feel like it's pretty dark." The other thing too to mention about Baker and why I feel like it's so dark is that it's a very misogynistic world. Like, there's a
Mm,
lot of misogyny in the world, and and it's hard to read that, especially in the first book. There's one scene in particular that made me very uncomfortable. Um, yeah, there are some uncomfortable, obviously, essay things that happen in the series. The second series, I feel like even though I feel like the second series, so there's 2 series. There's the Prince of Nothing trilogy, and then there's the Aspect Emperor Quartet. And in the Aspect Emperor Quartet, I feel like some of those darker things happen to male characters, whereas in the first trilogy, it happens to both, but maybe a more heavy towards the women because of the society specifically. And I feel like that changes in Aspect Emperor. But yeah, I love those books though, because the character psychology, in my opinion, is incredible. Baker's prose is maybe he has one of my favorite writing styles I've come across in
mhm,
fantasy. Uh, yes, definitely so much depth to the world building. If you love layers of history and world building, and it also obviously has a lot of nods to like Lord of the Rings and Dune, but in a very twisted, dark way. think it's fantastic. I think it's absolutely incredible. But
But it kind of
I,
also comes back to what you guys were saying about I Who Have Never Known Men, because underlying a lot of our Scott Baker stuff is this kind of psychological sense of
Mhm.
helplessness, the
Yes.
idea of being damned or doomed, or even kind
Yes.
of more broadly than that, that you're not in control of your own destiny, and the extent to which we're all just sort of continuing on the tracks that have been laid for us, that we're unable to escape. It seems like there's a through line there too.
Absolutely.
You know, if I
Mhm.
could just pivot very quickly, the other book I was thinking of, and I'm not sure if you guys would agree with me or whether anyone would agree with me, but one of the darkest books I feel like I've ever read is The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Um, and I was trying to think about this. Have you read it, Ashley? I know you have, Joanna.
I haven't.
Okay, so it's a comedy, and it's kind of in the same vein as something like Discworld, right? Where it's all about the jokes. There's like 3 or 4 jokes on every page, and it is incredibly funny and enjoyable and humorous. But at the same time, I do count it as one of the darkest things I've read. And I think I've been trying to think about why The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy is for me so intimidatingly dark. And I think it's, and we've said this word a few times, the absurdity of what's going on. So the premise, this isn't a spoiler, this is how the book begins. The premise of The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy is that the world is destroyed because the aliens are making a superhighway through the solar system, and so Earth needs to get out of the way, and so they blow up the Earth. And one human escapes, and he gets to go on his adventures around space and time. And that's the premise for all this wacky stuff to take place. But at the same time, like billions of people die at the start. You know what I mean? Like that's how things begin. And you meet some people at the start of the book who get killed off. There's a barkeep who's told he has 3 minutes to spend the change that he's been given. There's a demolition guy who's he gets told right at the start, well, none of this matters because you're going to be dead in 5 minutes. That is crazy dark, crazy bleak. And I think the reason that it kind of disturbs me is because, and this maybe also goes back to Abercrombie, how purposeless, I guess, it makes the world feel. In some ways, how cheap it makes the world feel. And some people, might think this about reality, but if anything can go away so quickly, if anyone is that expendable, that is kind of a real horrifying realization. And that is throughout all the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy books, this idea that people just die left, right, and center for laughs. But if you begin to unstitch it, the I guess the meaninglessness to it all is a little
Yeah.
bit terrifying under the surface. I don't know if either of you have any response to that, or you agree or disagree.
Yeah, yeah, I would say I completely understand why you would think that was dark, because I guess there's two sides to that, in terms of some books have a very clear, I guess, trajectory in the plot and the storyline, where all this sort of bad stuff is happening, all of this stuff is going on, and it is dark, but there is something at the end that ultimately is good, and that's what we're fighting for. And so in some sense you could sort of not disregard the bad that is happening, but it's going to happen. No, we accept that it's going to happen, knowing that we're getting to this end goal. And then there are some books or films or things that I've watched where they're just, it seems like there's nothing to fight for, there's nothing to work towards. So I think what you just said makes me think of that, where you say there's nothing to fight for, there's nothing, everything could just end immediately, what was the point, sort of thing. And I I think that it makes it so much worse, so much worse, um, when you look at it that way. So yeah, definitely.
Yeah, yeah, I agree with that. I agree with that. I think that is something true too about the First Lost series. Like, I feel like, so it's interesting because there can be dark fantasy, and I've certainly read a lot of dark fantasy where it really feels like the universe is evil and there's like these evil forces out there. But in the First Law world, what makes it so bleak is that the world is indifferent. It's
Hmm.
like people die and the birds might just tweet by kind of thing. It makes me think of Kurt Vonnegut a little bit of Slaughterhouse-Five, which is also very absurdist. And
Yes.
and so that's a really interesting point about Hitchhiker's Guide. I could see your point though. I could see your point. I did not think it was a dark read when I read it, but I can understand it is. It is if you really take that in, if you consider it from that point of view. Absolutely. And
There's
I love that you're bringing up the absurd too. I saw that we're going to be talking about that. And I'm like, I never thought that deeply about this word and how that relates to dark themes, but it really does. And I think some of it, I'm sorry, I'm just going to say one thing, and I'm sorry I interrupted you, David.
No, no,
But
it's
one
good.
thing I would say is, because we were talking about lack of agency, I think that when we have an absurdist element, or if there's some absurdity to our situation, it makes us feel like there's one, a lack of certainty and a lack of control over what's happening. So in that way, I feel like that's how sometimes the absurdity feels connected to the dark themes.
I've never interrupted you once in my life, Joanna. The score is 1-0. No, every time I interrupt you, I just snip it out and no one ever knows. No, so I do think. I mean, there's a scene in The Hitchhiker's Guide. I'm going to spoil it because I mean it's a book full of jokes. At one point, a whale gets generated out of the ether into space, and then the whale kind of falls to breaches the atmosphere of a planet that they're flying over and dies, and hits the ground and splat. And this whole chapter is the internal monologue of the whale coming into existence and then thinking about life and philosophy and going through all the deep thoughts and then dying. And the last line is something like, "Oh, it's the ground. I wonder if it'll be friends with me." And then the whale hits the ground and explodes into a million pieces. And it's played for laughs, but it's also deeply horrific. And whenever I do read these sections, I do think, "Oh, like they are unsettling, but the humor kind of masks the unsettling feeling." And I think Abercrombie is exactly the person to draw a parallel with there. The other thing about Abercrombie is his characters, right? I mean, there's something really dark about the fact that his characters are, and maybe back to that word doomed to never change. Because so many of Abercrombie's characters, all the way up through all the First Law books, come so close to being better people, and not one of them ever becomes a better person. And if that's Abercrombie's statement about life, I mean, that's basically as futile as it gets, isn't it? That none of us will ever change and we'll repeat our mistakes over and over and then we die. So, yeah, I think Abercrombie is one of the most talented writers writing in this kind of darker space, but he gets away with it, as we've said previously, because he's so funny.
He's
Yeah.
amazing. I love Abercrombie's writing so much. Yeah.
I do. I read his books like sort of the first time this year and immediately just became such a huge fan. I just adored him. I
Have
think
Yeah,
How
how
far
far are
through are
you?
you?
I just my most recent one is Best Served Cold. So I'm doing them all in publication order. So yeah,
Yeah.
Best Served Cold is my most recent. So I'll be on to the Heroes next. I
Yeah.
loved the First Law trilogy. I loved it.
Age
And
of
as you said,
Madness. I cannot wait for you to read Age of Madness, Ashley. Oh, it's so good.
I've
It's my
heard a lot of
favorite.
people say it's better. Yeah, I've heard so many people say it's amazing. So I'm really looking forward to that one. Really looking forward to that one.
Yeah.
So you've not read The
I
Heroes
loved
yet?
No, I've got the Heroes is up next.
That's my
That's up
favorite.
next.
It's so good.
Really? Is that your favorite
Yeah.
of the Versailles books?
Yeah, my jaw was on the floor that entire book. I think it was so
Yeah.
artfully done. And certain sequences, if I can put it that way, certain battle sequences
Yeah.
are just masterfully written. But
There
again,
aren't a
going back to
lot.
the idea of futility, that's a very futile book.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I love the Heroes too. My favorite though is the Age of Madness, and David and I actually disagree about this, but I actually think the Age of Madness is far more heavily thematic than any of the other First Law books, and the female characters are center stage. Like they're so Savine is incredible. I cannot wait for you to meet her. But I actually also liked Red Country, and that's a very unpopular opinion. People don't tend to love that standalone as much, but I loved it. All right,
I can't
sorry,
wait.
moving
I
on.
can't wait to read them. That's making me
Yeah.
want to read them much sooner now.
I'm so excited to hear your thoughts. Yeah.
I'm looking at my notes and I have a couple of other reasons why we might enjoy dark books. Can I throw these at you guys and see how you feel about them?
Of course you can.
So one is the idea of inoculation. And this is very much, we kind of spoke about this a little bit, but this is kind of more also in terms of young fiction and children's books, because there is such a sea of books that are aimed at young people that are horror, like R.L. Stein, stuff like that. I don't know if you guys ever read the Goosebumps books and things like that, but there's the idea that we read these kind of books when we're young. And Ashley, you said something about a safe space earlier, that they kind of allow us to kind of think about these things from a kind of safer standpoint. Did you guys ever read these kind of young horror books when you were kids, and how do you perceive them now that you're older?
Well, I guess I could speak first because I've reread a few of them recently,
Oh,
and they
interesting.
are hilarious because I cannot believe how predictable some of the plots have been. But they still. It depends. I think, how do I put this? I do think that young adult books are still. I know you were saying that you felt like the R.L. Stein goes some dark places. He does a little bit. I reread a book, or actually, no, I read it for the first time, a Fear Street novel that had this ski trip, and I'm just going to spoil it because there's this one scene where these teenagers are on the ski slopes and they're watching their friend ski down the slope, and then suddenly, as he's skiing down, his head just like he doesn't know there's a string there, and his head gets decapitated, and his body just keeps on skiing down the mountain, and his head rolls around down. And I was like, wow, when I read that. Yeah, I appreciated him going there. Uh, but yeah, I do think I know I was definitely that kid that was into the scary stuff, and I wanted to read things like that, and I don't know. I certainly don't think it's as disturbing as Stephen King. Like, I have friends who were, and you're probably one of them, David, right? Like, weren't you reading Stephen King when you were like 9 years old or something ridiculous like that?
Teenager. I can't remember exactly when, but
Oh,
yeah,
okay. Yeah. I mean, I have friends that have done that. They were
yeah.
reading like Pet Cemetery and It when they were like 12. And I don't know how you could do that at that age, honestly, but I don't think I did watch horror movies when I was a kid too. But yeah, there is something about that. And like again, going back to the campfire thing, I think that there's something about that that is appealing to children, that's appealing to us for whatever reason.
Did you get bad dreams, as everyone's parents says that you will if you consume this kind of horror stuff? Did you feel like it actually had a bit of an adverse effect when you were consuming this kind of stuff?
No, I didn't, but I did have bad dreams. I did have
Yeah.
nightmares. I specifically had a recurring nightmare as a kid of a chopped off hand. That's a whole other story, but I never had anything that was triggered by something I read or something I watched at that time that I know of, unless it
Hmm.
happened and I didn't know that there was a connection there.
Hmm. Ashley, what do you think?
I didn't read any dark books as a kid. None. There's none that come to mind that I can think of. I didn't read Goosebumps, anything like that. I don't know. I'm trying to think of. I don't know. Maybe it's because I was partially raised by my grandparents, so maybe they just like kept me in the sort of fairy tale bubble for a little bit longer. But I never read anything dark when I was younger. But I was exposed to a lot of dark sort of films and series and games, and it was actually quite strange that often games that have got like the age ratings on, I would be 9 or 10 and I would have the 18 games, which
Mhm.
bizarre considering what I've just said. It completely defeats the other thing that I just said. But yeah, so films and things that I did used to really enjoy watching horror films and dark films and playing dark games as a kid. I never had any problems with them. I never had any sort of like nightmares or anything. But I didn't start reading dark books until I was an adult. So yeah, maybe I thought I enjoyed it so much in film form, I'll seek out in book form now that I'm older.
Yeah.
I used to buy those kind of big CD cases for my video games, so my parents wouldn't see the age rating on the label. Stuff like the Fallout games and Gears of War and all that kind of stuff is 18, and so I just throw the box away and just put the CD in so that no one would ever
They won't
know.
know.
No, I remember very clearly one time I was playing a game called Dead Rising, which is a fantastic, like really old Xbox game, zombies. And I remember my dad just walking into the living room and looking at the screen, and I have like a chainsaw, and I'm like age 13, and I'm just like tearing zombies to shreds. And my dad just looks at the TV, he looks at me, he just goes, "Oh, David," and he walks out the room. We never spoke about it again.
Wow.
Um,
Maybe he thought
yeah.
it was inevitable.
It is this thing. I mean, this is a separate conversation when you're a child, what you think you are capable of consuming versus now looking back and thinking, what is appropriate.
Wow.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's strange because actually, as my dad used to show me sort of films that were a lot older than what I was supposed to be watching, but he would always actually say to me beforehand, "You shouldn't really be watching this," but and he would always explain it. He would always say, "This is the bad thing. This is the thing that
Oh.
makes it sort of more adult," and
Mm,
he would sort of explain, this isn't real life, or if it was a story, or he would say it was based on history, so that's why they've shown it and things. So he would actually explain it to me, and I guess make that line really clear of why, why it was bad.
Mm,
But it's okay to watch it because he would always say it was like educational. We were learning about something.
mm.
So it was, yeah, he always made it very clear. So I'd always get like a little speech before before everything. Um,
Wow, that's
yeah,
great.
but
Yeah,
maybe that's what made it. I never saw it as being a bad thing.
yeah.
Whereas I had friends that weren't nowhere, they weren't allowed anywhere near those kinds of things.
That's
Mm.
interesting. That's so interesting. Yeah, it's interesting because I grew up in I'm Mexican American, so I grew up in a Hispanic household, and there were several ghost stories from my grandparents growing up, and I think some of the like Mexican folklore were also stories that were kind of cautionary tales that would integrate some horror aspects. So, like for example, there's a tale of La Llorona, which is about this ghost woman who haunts the river, and it's supposed to be the story of, and the ghost is supposed to be of a woman who drowned her children in the river or something like that. And then there's also this story that I remember hearing as a child that was about a young teenage girl who wanted to go to a dance, and her parents said no, they forbid her to go to the dance. She sneaks out, goes to the dance, and then the most handsome guy in the room targets her and asks her to dance. And so she's excited, she dances with him, and the next thing you know, they're dancing the whole night away. They're the last ones left in the dance, and then she suddenly looks down and sees that his feet are hooves and that he's the devil, that she's been dancing with the devil. And so it was like this tale that was told to scare kids into not sneaking out and into obeying their parents. And so I feel like I was brought up with things like that. So those were kind of, again, the campy, fun, but also creepy stories that I think maybe normalized horror for me a little bit, but I don't know. It seems something that maybe was integrated somewhat into my culture as well. Mhm.
I think cautionary tales are one of these things where we allow a little bit more of the darkness to seep in, don't we?
Yes, I think so.
The other thing I'm thinking of just as you were speaking is they're not nursery rhymes. What are they? The kind of sing-songy stuff we
Oh, yeah.
yeah. So there was an old woman who swallowed a fly. Did that make it across to the States? That song?
It sounds vaguely familiar, but I'm more familiar with like Ring Around the Rosies,
Yep. Well,
right?
there's also we're going on a bear hunt would be another one that I'm thinking of. um, where we're going on a bear hunt, and you kind of mime it along with the song, and you go through the grass, and the idea is that you're going to get to the bear, and then there's two versions to all of these kind of sing-songy kids stories. One story is that you get to the bear, and the bear wakes up, and then you're singing the story, and you run back, and you escape, and you get to be safe. Um, and then there's also the alternate take that sometimes your teacher, if he was a very kind of cool teacher, or whoever, when they're singing with you, you'd get to the point where the bear wakes up, and then be like, and then the bear ate everybody, or whatever the conclusion to that song is. And I always used to be very fascinated with this as a kid. That we'd have these songs with the good ending and the bad ending, and it was totally up to the narrator which one they were going to choose at the time. Um, so I do find it interesting how we introduce kind of darker storytelling and darker concepts, and even bad endings and bad resolutions to young people.
Yes, I agree with you. I mean, also the Grimm fairy tales, aren't those
Yeah.
also known for having being quite a bit dark, much darker than Disney?
Yeah.
Is it not that Ariel like turned into bubbles or something at the end of the Little Mermaid?
Is it Bubbles? I can't remember. I thought it was
Oh,
maybe Stone, but I could be wrong
Yeah.
about that. I get you. You might be right.
Google's AI overview. In Hans Christian Andersen's original tale, The Little Mermaid does not get a happy ending. Instead, she turns to sea foam after her prince marries another woman. Her sisters give her a dagger to kill the prince, but she cannot. And as dawn breaks, she throws the dagger into the sea and dissolves into foam. So, bit different.
oh my gosh.
So you were both right.
Yay.
There we go.
I know our time is short. One thing I would quite like to bring up, and it's connected to uh, what you were saying about the lottery. A
Mhm.
lot of the darkest stories, when I was kind of making a little list for myself, tend to be short stories. I don't know if you guys found the same thing. I can think of a lot of short fiction that is just insanely terrifying, but has a very, very short kind of number of pages.
So once again, David, you are. I don't know how well read you are with short stories, Ashley, but David is extremely well read when it comes to short stories, is what I've learned recently, and I'm just not. I'm not. The only. It is interesting because my favorite short story right now. Well, actually, there are a couple that I really love. That I would say one is "The Death of Ivan Ilyich" by Tolstoy is by far my favorite short story, and that is certainly a cautionary tale, and it certainly has a little touch of absurdity to it, and it is a little bit of humor because of that. It does have a little bit of humor because of that, but I don't know that I would consider it horror or it does deal with death, but I don't know if I necessarily felt like it got under my skin and not I don't know. I guess it is kinda dark. I'll just say it's dark. And then the other one is, oh gosh, A Good Man is Hard to Find by Flannery O'Connor, which is
Mm.
also incredibly bleak. I wouldn't call that a cautionary tale either, but it certainly goes into some dark themes. But yeah, I don't know if I have any other examples of short stories that are dark or ones that necessarily fit that exact description.
Well, it's I guess it's not really about them being cautionary tales. It's about them being very much more like a splinter of darkness. I think it's that thing when you're reading a 600, 700 page novel, unless you're committing to something like R. Scott Bakker or you're committing to something like A Little Life, very quickly that amount of content becomes very overwhelming very quickly. And maybe it's a case in which these authors are able just to go a bit darker because they don't have to extend it over 20, 30, 40, 50 plus pages. They give you just a little sliver of utter terror and then they can get away with it. So I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream is fabulous. It's about a supercomputer. It's very timely. A supercomputer takes over the whole world, kills everyone apart from 5 people. I think 5. That the computer's called like I think, therefore I am. Just tortures them endlessly. And so the whole story, 10 to 20 pages long. I think Harlan Ellison himself has read it out. Is just horrifying. And I don't think you could tell a story like that in 300, 400 pages without most people throwing in the towel. But because it's so short, you can kind of get away with it. I think Stephen King does something similar. I think The
Mm.
Lottery also is something similar. So I'm wondering as well if a lot of the most terrifying stuff comes in the package of short fiction. But I think A Good Man is Hard to Find is one of the premier examples of that. I don't think A Good Man is Hard to Find could be 400, 500 pages long and have that same sting.
That's true. I don't think it
Mm.
could either. Yeah.
No,
It's
that's a really good point. I hadn't considered that actually. Have you ever encountered a story that was to you so dark that you felt that you had to stop and not continue? Because and maybe this is where I sort of keep saying I sort of think about my own morals and my own reason for reading these stories is that have never I've always wanted to know whether what was going on that was so dark was justified in a sense that
Mm.
yes.
so I always have wanted to carry on because I wanted to not the payoff as such. It seems like there has to be some kind of exchange, but I do feel like if you're going to put some of those dark scenes in, I feel like they do need to be earned in some way
Yes.
for me.
Yes.
And so I think I there's a part of me that refuses to put it down because I just want to know if it was worth it. Doesn't seem like the right phrase to use, but yeah, I guess if it was an okay choice overall. So I've never put anything down, but I know so many people will just encounter something, and I guess it comes down to your own experience and what you've been through as a person as well. That we all have different lines of where we'll sort of draw them. But I've never put one down because of it being too dark.
I think I totally understand what you mean because you want to see what the author is doing with that. Like where is it going? What is the purpose of that? And I've certainly had that question before when I've encountered some darker things in books. And I will say there is one example I have where I did put a book down that got too much for me. And I once received a very patronizing comment about it, like, "Oh, well, maybe you just can't take dark stuff." And I'm like, "Okay, well,
And I
whatever."
apologized for that comment, Joanna. And I'm just kidding.
And this is my unpopular opinion because the book is very, very loved by those who've read it. but Kushiel's Dart by Jacqueline Carey, I think is the author.
I
Goodness, I
think
should look that up. It's a very popular book, and it deals with BDSM. And I remember I picked it up after I read A Song of Ice and Fire the first time, and so I felt pretty comfortable with my ability to handle difficult or disturbing material in a book. But when I read that book, I DNF'd it. I had a library copy, and I don't know how far I got into the book, but I know I got a pretty good chunk into the book. And I remember I found much of the storytelling very compelling, but it was just this idea that somebody could be like engage in being hurt in that way and enjoy it. And like it to me, I just kept getting this idea that there was almost like a message that women like this. And I'm like, I don't know. I just couldn't take it. It disturbed me so deeply. And so yeah, that hit a limit for me. And I've never encountered a limit like that since. And I've often wondered, I'm glad I DNF'd it. I think it was right to honor that boundary at the time because that was a boundary. And I think we have to acknowledge and listen to those things. But I do wonder at the same time what would have happened if I had kept going. Would I have come to understand what the author was trying to do in a deeper way? Kind of like what you're asking, Ashley. Like, would I have forgiven it later on with more context? A lot of people said that have read on in the book, because there are a lot of fans who have said that that the idea that does not continue in a gratuitous way throughout the rest of the book. Uh, but yeah, I'm just not sure. I'm just not sure. Because the whole entire idea behind the character in that book is that she seems to have some kind of, if I remember correctly, and it's been over 10 years, so I don't really remember exact details, but I remember she has some kind of like mark in her eye, and she has some kind of curse where anytime she feels pain, she feels pleasure. So pain and pleasure are interconnected. And so it is thematically relevant to the story, but I struggled with it.
No,
Do you know that
I
that
get
does
that.
make me think of what you were saying about Game of Thrones, the TV show, and how certain characters are handled. I have two answers to your question, Ashley. The first one, it goes back to the idea of death games. Now, it's not really books; it's just kind of fiction in general. Where I went through a period a couple of years ago where I watched a heck of a lot of death game sort of subgenre stuff. So I watched Squid Game season one, which is worth watching and is clever. And I've also watched Alice in Borderland, which I think is good. Hunger Games is a really great kind of death game subgenre. And there's some really good books like The Running Man and The Long Walk. Both of those are coming out this year as movies, those Stephen King stories. I think there's some really good death game stuff. But I realized I was beginning to sort of watch them not because of the story or because of the ideas underneath. I was just watching them because I was quite enjoying watching people kind of getting whacked off left, right, and center. So I was beginning to go into Netflix, and you know how it says if you enjoyed this, you might enjoy this one. And I realized that I was watching a lot of like B movie horror that was just because it was also a death game. And I realized that I wasn't watching them for any other reason than I was just enjoying watching the number of 50 people getting whittled down to one at the end. And I didn't like that part of myself. I didn't like the idea that I'd be watching some kind of it felt very much like the equivalent of reading or watching, like when there's a car crash on the highway and everyone turns to look like that. It kind of felt like I was doing that with my consumption of these kind of TV shows. And so when I realized that, I very much limited this type of subgenre that I consume. The story has to be good. If I'm just reading it or watching it because it's part of this subgenre, I do question that about myself. But the other one that I wanted to bring up very quickly, Ashley, was A Little Life, which I have 3 copies of. I have bought it 3 times in the past 5 or 6 years because I keep seeing it on sale on the call. I've heard this is a really good book, but I'm too scared to start it because everyone says that by the time you finish it, you are a shadow of who you were when you started the book. And no one seems to have said that they were happy having read the book. I've never heard anyone say, I read A Little Life and I loved it. So I was wondering if you could speak to that very quickly.
Yes, so I've both read it and seen the show of it on stage. I've seen the theatre show of it.
There's a show.
So
Sorry.
it was done on stage, and I mean beautifully acted, but my goodness, just as devastating. Yeah, so I've seen both. It's kind of similar to, I won't put them in the same bracket, but in terms of how I discuss them. So if I've never spoken about it on my channel, but obviously I've been talking about Berserk a lot recently. I've sort of said very clearly on my channel that I'm not recommending this as such. I'm just saying that I'm really enjoying it. And if you're interested in what I'm reading, this is it. And because I would never recommend it to somebody, and I would say the same for A Little Life. I would never recommend that to anybody, because I think if somebody read that based on my recommendation, they would really worry about me. it it I did find with that book for me is just, it is suffering, and I think a lot of people would say it's so much more. It is a huge commentary on friendship and growing older and companionship. There's so many things, but there is an enormous amount of suffering. And it, I would say, as much as people can suffer and go through suffering, and I don't think, it's never just necessarily an isolated experience. Sometimes people go through lots of things where they could be suffering. In particular, one character in that book goes through so much suffering at every stage of their life. It got to a point where there was one scene, and I finished the book because, again, I think it was what I was saying earlier, I just wanted to see if it was justified. And there was one scene that happened, and I put it down for a moment, and I just said, I don't think this needed to be in here. This scene did not need to exist. The book would have still been incredibly devastating, incredibly dark. And it just crossed the line where I just thought, I think this is almost going to shock factor now. And it felt really gratuitous at that point. And I finished the book, and it didn't feel like it was worth it. It didn't feel like, that was my experience. I know some people absolutely adore the book. I will say one thing, it is written beautifully. Writing is absolutely stunning. But it felt at one point that it was suffering for suffering's sake. And I think for me, it did cross a line. And I didn't gain any that. And even though there were some really beautiful moments, that there were no for me funny moments or moments that made me smile, anything like that. The whole thing just had it was just completely bleak. So I would never recommend it to anybody. And I feel like a lot of people would disagree with me, because I think a lot of people do adore it. But it was really bleak, and the stage show was really, really challenging to watch as well. Literally seeing it brought to life was really difficult. So yeah, no, I think at the time I felt like I needed to, because at the time I was really explicitly sort of giving my ratings because I was part of the book club, and it was a book club read. And I think I rated it 5 stars at the time, because I didn't want to give it anything lower because of everything that I felt that if I said it was a bad book, then I was undermining the themes that it went into, and that I wasn't doing it justice. But yeah, no, I wouldn't recommend it.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. Um, yeah, I've heard similar things, I think, about the book before. I want to say it's one of the terms I've heard is like, quote, misery porn is how some people have described it.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Really quick, going back to what you were saying about Berserk, that you're like, I'm telling you I'm enjoying it, but I'm not necessarily recommending it. That's exactly how I feel every time I talk about Baker, because I feel like I totally understand why some people would not want to read that as their kind of fantasy. I can totally understand that. And I feel very careful about who I recommend that series to.
I think that is a wonderful place to end things. Thank you so much to both of you for being involved in this discussion. I had a great time talking with you, me and my pumpkins, and I will be linking to both of your channels down below. Please check them out. They're amazing. They're awesome. And I'm here too. But in the meantime, I will see you on the next video. Thank you very much. Goodbye, guys. See you. Bye.